My cat broke into the room. Hopefully she'll just stay over there. Well, I think we can at least get started. Sorry if you hear her meowing. Welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on to tonight's program. My name is Matt Schumann. I am a programming librarian here at Carey. And sorry, she's just making me laugh. Before we begin, please let me know if you're experiencing any technical issues. If you have any questions tonight, you should be able to use the Q&A button, or you can use the raise hand function and ask away. This program is made possible by the generous donors to the Carey Library Foundation and in partnership with the PBD Institute Library in Danvers, Dedham Public Library, and Belmont Public Library. With us tonight is Erika Howsare, born and raised in southwestern Pennsylvania, earned a BA at Oberlin College and holds an MFA from Brown University. Erika is the author of The Age of Deer, also the author which is tonight's talk, and then also the author of 2 books of poetry, and her essays, reviews, and interviews are found in places like the Rumpus, Los Angeles Review of Books, LongReads, and the Brooklyn Rail. One of her essays was named a notable mention in the Best American Food Writing of 2020 and the Best American Science and Nature Writing of 2020. Along with her husband and 2 daughters, she lives in the Blue Ridge of Central Virginia, where she works in local journalism and teaches writing in the community. So now, please welcome Erika.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you to the Carey Library for inviting me to speak this evening, and thanks to everybody who's watching. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. So what I'm going to do this evening is just talk a little bit about the book, some background on it. I'm going to show you some images, some of which are in the book, not all of them, as a way of kind of getting at some of the major themes and the most interesting stories and facts that I discovered while researching the book. And then I will read from part of a chapter to give you a taste of what it actually sounds like. So this book, in a way, it goes back to my childhood growing up outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where there's a pretty big deer hunting culture, and some of our relatives and family friends were hunters, and that was always something that stood out to me in my kind of, environment growing up as a kind of intense and vivid element of what was around me there. And when I was doing my MFA, this is about 20 years ago, I had written a piece about deer that kind of talked about some of those memories of the hunting culture, and also other issues that I could see were part of the relationship between people and deer, things like, car accidents and people getting frustrated with deer and feeling like there were too many deer. So 20 years ago, I had some notion that this was an interesting topic to me, but then the idea kind of went underground for quite a long time. Within about 5 years or so ago, I started to think about it again. I had always been interested in questions about kind of the human place in nature, how we fit in here on the earth, and what we're even talking about when we use the word nature or say that something is natural. So I've been trying to unpack those questions for a long time in different ways with different kinds of writing. And about 5 years ago, it occurred to me that deer would be a really great lens to look through to ask those questions. We do have a very close relationship with them back into the deep past, and certainly still today. And they're also kind of unique in being, for many of us, especially in the eastern US, they're the only large wild animal that we're likely to see often in our daily lives. They're good at living among us. So we have this kind of neighborly relationship with them. I think of them as neighbors, and that helps me to sort of see that just like with human neighbors, we're glad that they're there, but we sometimes get in each other's way or get on each other's nerves. And we do have some very contradictory feelings about deer. So I just had this hunch that they'd be a really rich topic to explore. So I started working on a proposal for the book, and two of the first things I did were to start researching deer in mythologies and art from around the world, which I thought, oh, maybe I'll find a few kind of colorful tales, a few examples here and there. I didn't realize what a rich trove actually of stories and art that I would find about deer, much more than I expected. The other thing I did right away was to set up some news alerts on deer and a couple of other terms. And so that brought me a kind of daily email digest of like what they were doing out there in the world. How are they showing up in our world right now? And right away, I began to see this constant stream of things that are happening between deer and people in our contemporary world, all these different interactions that we have with them. And pretty quickly, I could see some themes there. Of course, we hunt them, we hit them with our cars, or we try not to hit them with our cars or worry that we're going to. They eat our gardens, and they sometimes crash into buildings. So those kinds of things tend to make us see them as pests, but then we also look at them as victims. And there's a whole genre of news stories about people rescuing deer from bad situations, like getting stuck in a fence or falling into an icy pond, those kinds of things. And then, of course, beyond all of that, we just continue to love them and admire them for their beauty. And we also associate them with wilderness and kind of pristine places, which, as it turns out, is not all that accurate, but we do have that association that's very strong. So those I could see, right away, those were going to be kind of the themes, and those became the sort of scaffolding for the book and for my research. And I had just so much fun following all those threads into many, many different realms of life and our culture that I really had never imagined. Each of those threads kind of led me further than I had expected, which is a really cool thing because one of the mythological kind of tropes with deer is that they lead people to new realizations. They'll often appear in a story. Usually there's a person who's a hunter who spots the deer, and then the deer leads them on a long chase, and the hunter ends up going further than they had ever intended, and they discover a new life or a new group to join, or they decide to found a monastery in this new place. Some their life changes in some way, and I really feel like that actually happened for me through the process of researching the book. I did lots and lots of reading on everything from deer ecology to the history of conservation, and I also got to do a lot of traveling. I met with scientists and a woman who rehabilitates fawns and people who practice culling of deer and artists who use deer imagery in their work. And then the biggest challenge for me, and this kind of becomes the climax of the book, was to enter into that world of deer hunting that I had grown up adjacent to, but not really part of, not engaged with. Luckily for me, one of my brothers is now a deer hunter, so that made it gave me an entree into that world. I joined him and some of our other relatives on their annual hunts in Pennsylvania. And that was a very deep and kind of layered experience that I write about near the end of the book. Okay, so now I'm going to share my screen and we'll talk a little bit about some of the more standout things that I learned. So the book begins with a chapter on deer in art and mythologies from around the world, which are some of the examples are really quite ancient. We're looking at an image here from the famous cave art site in France, Lascaux. So Lascaux and the other major cave galleries in Europe, deer are one of the 4 most frequently depicted subjects in those sites. So that really, to me, says something about their significance to ancient people in that area. Here's another very old work of art. This is a piece of metal work that was made probably for the Celts by the Thracians, who were great metal workers. And this is just a really exquisite piece. It's called the Gundestrup Cauldron. And it shows this central figure who's some kind of deity, who's sporting a great rack of antlers. And I love the fact that he's next to a deer who has, very similar antlers. So there's a kind of equivalence there between this kind of human deity figure and the animal. And then jumping somewhat forward in time, this is an image from the Yaqui culture, which is located in, it's an indigenous group located in southern Arizona and northern Sonora, Mexico. So it's both sides of the US-Mexico border. And there's a great tradition in this culture of an annual deer dance, where the dancers wear a deer head on top of their own head. So again, it's this repeating idea in many mythologies of deer and humans kind of merging into a single figure. And the purpose of this Yaqui deer dance, it's very complex, but it really kind of boils down to this idea of asking the deer for permission to hunt them. So it's asking for a successful hunt, but it's addressing the deer and saying, will you please be willing to give your life to sustain us? And what's fascinating is, here's another example from a completely different place. This is in a little village in England called Abbots Bromley. And it's essentially, this is a tradition in Abbots Bromley that's been going on for close to 800 years. The dancers wear, this is called the horn dance, and the dancers wear reindeer antlers as they dance. I got to go and see this in person. It was amazing. But it's essentially exactly the same as that Yaqui dance. It's asking for a successful hunt. And it's doing that by making the dancers into a sort of half human, half animal figure. So then the book goes on to talk about some more history. So it talks about the place that deer held in both North America and in Europe prior to the first contact between people from these 2 continents. So for indigenous people in North America, there was a heavy reliance on deer in many places for not only meat, but hides and other body parts. A deer could provide everything from food to tools to paint and dozens of other things. So here are a few images from the Jamestown settlement in Virginia, where I live. This is a couple hours away from where I live. It's near the coast, and part of the museum there is a recreated Powhatan village, which represents the culture that existed there before the English showed up. And in that village, there are many examples of deer bodies being used for different purposes. So this is a hide that's being stretched so it can be tanned, maybe to be turned into buckskin, which is a really nice soft leather. Here's another hide that the fur is left on and it's being used as a blanket in a home. Buckskin moccasins. Here's a buckskin bag. Here's a skull and antlers that's being used as a kind of rack inside a home to hold things. And here's a museum interpreter there who's, she's obviously wearing a buckskin garment. And then what she's doing there is making cordage out of deer sinew. So it's the tough connective tissue, probably from along the spine. That's, I understand, kind of the longest and strongest fibers that the deer's body provides. So she's twisting that in a special way to make this very strong cordage. So this was a very important relationship, for humans in that time and place. Deer were these essential providers. They provided all these materials, and these images I've showed you really just scratch the surface of the things that you could get from a deer. And so there were complex mythologies and practices that developed to kind of explain and protect that important relationship. Now, for the Europeans who arrived, there was a different relationship with deer. So they were more accustomed to thinking of deer instead of this kind of essential common resource. They thought of deer more as a scarce, inaccessible resource that was only for the nobility to be able to access. So by the Middle Ages, in certainly in England and France, all deer had been considered the property of the royalty, and only nobles had the right to hunt. So this image shows deer likely inside a deer park, which was a kind of common thing that a nobleman would create on his estate, was a fenced area where deer would be kind of managed and cared for by gamekeepers so that the nobles could come and do these elaborate ritualistic hunts that were kind of about obtaining venison, but really their more important purpose was just for the nobility to kind of show off their wealth and their power and to reaffirm, yes, I am the one who has the right to kill deer, and commoners don't. Commoners will be, severely punished. This is actually part of where the Robin Hood mythology comes from, is the idea of, common people needing to access this food, this important food source. So when colonists from that context arrived here in North America and found that deer were pretty numerous and that you could hunt them freely without being punished, they really took notice of that. That was a very surprising and amazing situation for them. So deer became one of the major reasons why Europeans viewed North America as this incredibly bountiful, abundant place. And that wasn't just about hunting deer for personal use. There was also, it became an economic engine and a driver of the colonization process. There was this whole trade in deer skins that sprang up during the colonial period and saw thousands of hides cross the Atlantic up until about the time of the American Revolution. Most of those hides that traveled to Europe ended up being used to make things like breeches, gloves, also belts for machinery, because this is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and other uses. Most of those hides had been hunted by Native men and processed by Native women. Meanwhile, buckskin was also a pretty important material for settlers on this side. So the white settlers who were kind of, moving into the frontier, always moving westward, venison was an important food for them, and buckskin was an important material. So this is a what's called a hunting jacket, and this is something that a white frontiersman or hunter might have worn to make it easier to kind of move around in the woods. It protects you. This is a pretty nice, fancy example. I don't think they were all quite this elaborate, but this is a kind of special one that's been preserved. And you can see how this type of garment then becomes this just long-standing symbol of the frontiersman and frontier culture. So here's Fess Parker playing Davy Crockett, wearing a very similar garment. And here's Teddy Roosevelt wearing something similar. He was not a frontiersman. He was a wealthy Manhattanite, but as we know, he was really into hunting, and he wanted to kind of style himself as being connected to that earlier time in American history when people like Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett were active. And so, Roosevelt was involved in some important conservation work around deer. We'll get to that in a couple minutes, including founding the Boone and Crockett Club, which he named after Davy Crockett, Daniel Boone. But Roosevelt wanted to also kind of style himself, or now we would say brand himself, as being, really literally connected to that frontier culture. And I was told that this buckskin costume that he's wearing for this photo was made for him by Brooks Brothers, which is a little fact that I like. So one of the important stories that the book tells is about the severe decline in the American deer population that happened during those colonial years, and especially through the 19th century. There was just a rampant overhunting of deer. There was also habitat loss that happened. And the result of all that was that it's very hard for us to picture now, but entire states became empty of deer by around the turn of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. There were states where the deer were almost entirely extirpated. There were other states where there might be a few deer hanging on in isolated pockets, but throughout, most of the state, a person would not expect to see a deer. It just wouldn't happen. Fortunately for deer, and I would say for us, the conservation movement did take hold around that time, partially led by this guy, Teddy Roosevelt, and some of his associates. And that movement did manage to rebuild deer populations through regulating hunting and through other means, including restocking deer in a lot of states, which is a pretty amazing fact that I had never known about them, and to me just has such a distinct bearing on this whole question of, are deer overpopulated, and if so, why? The fact that humans took such a deliberate hand in rebuilding those deer populations, to me, is just a really fascinating thing, and it does go back to that original kind of set of questions that I mentioned at the beginning about, what is natural. So certainly white-tailed deer are a native animal here. They do belong here, but at what point do you still call them natural when their population was first, driven way, way down by human activity and then deliberately rebuilt? The lines just get really fuzzy. So as we know, the success of that conservation effort means that in our time, we find ourselves often thinking of deer as overpopulated, which is a whole other very sticky, complicated question that I write about in the book. And it has a number of consequences for ecology and for human life and for the deer themselves. And so there's lots more to say about all that. But what I'm going to do now is stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to read to you from just part of a chapter that's in kind of the middle of the book, where I am looking at some of those consequences of the very, very successful rebuilding of the deer population that has kind of led us to where we are now, where a lot of people are sharing their space with a lot of deer. So this chapter is called Should Not Be. And I will just be reading part of this. Should not be. It was kind of a slow day for court, Anthony Worley told me when I asked about that strange day in December 2021. He's a security officer at the Transylvania County Courthouse in Brevard, North Carolina. He mans the X-ray machine that scans people's bags when they enter the building. The incident happened during the sleepy afternoon dip that follows lunch. I was sitting at the security desk down here and I had all the cameras pulled up, he said. I just happened to glance over, and in a split second, I saw something moving very fast toward the glass. There was just long enough for me to kick the chair out from underneath me and grab my gun. Worley is also an ex-Marine, and when he saw a mysterious object hurtling toward the door, his instinct was to protect everybody inside. Another officer behind him, thinking someone was ramming a car into the building, dove behind Worley's chair. But when I saw it was a deer, it was like, oh, okay, let go of the gun. A yearling buck crashed through the glass with a sound like dishes breaking. I guess it had its front legs all the way out in full stride, so it went through the door like it was nothing, Worley said. It landed and started to scramble. The floor is a smooth tile surface, and it couldn't get traction on the floor, like a dog trying not to slide in the kitchen, and that's how we were able to get control of it. He and the other officer tackled the deer and had it immobilized within seconds. Then came the hard part. The other guy, he's like, keep its head down. I don't want it biting, said Worley. I'm like, it's an herbivore. I knew the hooves were the dangerous part, so I maintained control of the legs, which was exhausting. Blood smeared on the floor. The deer had been cut by broken glass. One of the clerks of court, she was kind of petting it on its head, saying, poor baby, it's okay, it's okay. The officers felt they needed to wait for more trained help before moving the deer outside, which left the two men and the buck trapped in a stalemate there behind the X-ray machine. They'd radioed the fire department, animal control, and a government wildlife biologist, but it was 15 minutes before anyone could get there. Meanwhile, Worley said, it kicked the ever-living fool out of me. It was 2 months after the incident when I interviewed him, and he claimed he still had deer-inflicted bruises on his arms and legs. He was also bleeding, his blood mingling with the deer's blood on the floor and on his uniform pants. But in the heat of the moment, he felt no pain. I didn't realize it was working me out. He tried handcuffing the deer's back legs to subdue it, but it whipped the empty cuff around like a nunchuck, battering his hands. Finally, a firefighter showed up with a rope bag, like you'd use on a whitewater rescue, Worley explained. They tied up the animal and carried it outside through the shattered door. Other than cuts, it was unhurt. They let it run off. The incident made the rounds on the news and on Facebook. Worley changed his profile picture to an image of himself holding down the deer. Nobody knew what became of the buck, but they did use video footage to piece together what had happened right before it burst into the courthouse. For some reason, it had been running wildly among parked cars and had charged headfirst into the brick wall of a Veterans History Museum next door. As human space unfurls its fingers further into the landscape, and as deer populations swell in suburban zones, animals inevitably wind up in the places we think of as belonging to us. Deer should not be in schools, offices, grocery stores, flower shops, sandwich joints, hospitals, drugstores, shopping malls, nursing homes, museums, banks, hair salons, dormitories, convenience stores, furniture showrooms, laser labs housing million-dollar equipment, Tesco's or Walmart's. Deer shouldn't be dashing through crowds of 5K runners or joining in Black Lives Matter protests. They shouldn't be knocking down a guy as he's walking through a McDonald's parking lot. They shouldn't be photobombing a couple's engagement portraits on the beach or shutting down traffic on the George Washington Bridge. They shouldn't be cantering through a car park in Scotland. They shouldn't be jumping into school buses and landing on students. But they are, and in lots of houses too. Come on, barks a man in a video of a buck trapped in a Midwestern bedroom. The deer doesn't seem to know what that means. It just clatters back and forth between the bed and the armoire. This deer, like others that have entered homes, will wind up dead. Something about these events needles the modern mind. The very idea of order rests on an opposing idea of disorder. Once you draw lines through the world designating separate human spaces, you've opened the possibility of animals violating those borders. Then those animals become vermin, a kind of living pollution. Scholars use words like wrenching and uncanny to describe such accidental dislocations, but the accidents are in our minds as much as in space. Although we conceive of cities as being animal-free, they are in fact teeming with animal life. We also can't tolerate the incursion for any length of time. Of course, we classify groups of people in the same ways we do animals. If we're in a position of power, we are often quite willing to look at the marginalized as a form of pollution. This is no less true when those people or animals are displaced from their own homes, the places and ways of life they themselves would prefer. Animals, too, can be refugees. We may try to corral the unsettling reality by getting cutesy. This guy really wanted to learn, commented the head of a South Carolina school entered by a buck. After letting a deer out of a school in New Hampshire, police made a suspect sketch of the animal and put it on Facebook. Deer are said to tour museums, to be surprise guests, to do some shopping. More often, we use language that blames. Deer are sneaky or nosy. We say that deer break in, barge in, run loose, run riot. They go the wrong way through emergency exits. They leave a bloody trail and trash the room and send customers running for cover. These terms tend to emphasize the human perspective, but the deer must be as anxious as any person lost and alone in the wilderness would be. Sometimes we do glimpse a playful aspect of their behavior. They've been said to score soccer goals in backyard nets, then do a victory dance, to frolic with poodles, to nose experimentally at wind chimes. But humans hold the title for most elaborate amusements. One business in Syracuse, New York, called I Smash, offered rage rooms where customers could pay to smash electronics and glass. Two groups of customers were there one Sunday when a whitetail crashed through the front window. The manager and the police chased it out. Our priority was to protect customers, the manager told a reporter, adding that no one was injured by the flying glass. From the window, that is. Presumably, the customers then returned to smashing glass. A deer bursting through a storefront window might seem like a mistake. But in fact, there is a long cultural history of mutually crossing the borders that separate us from deer. And these events aren't random at all. They're an emblematic issue of our time. Each collision of deer and human reality is an accident of our own deliberate making. We built the store, and in a real sense, we put the deer, complete with instincts honed over millennia of evolution, in front of the glass. One could argue that in many ways, our support of deer's existence in dense human spaces is passive, but people all over the country also actively support deer by feeding them. Examine their motives and you find more accidents, more fuzzy ethics, more fantasies. Not so long ago, feeding wildlife was sanctioned. Some states fed deer to support herds for hunters' sakes, and Yellowstone National Park rangers in the early 20th century would feed bears as entertainment for visitors. Encouraging a carnival-type atmosphere, Yosemite kept deer behind fences in a park zoo until 1932. A 1929 photo shows a Yosemite ranger helping a deer smoke a pipe. But these days, like their counterparts in other countries, wildlife experts in the US discourage feeding wild deer, and many locations ban it outright. Minnesota, for example, forbids the practice in about half the state. The Minnesota Wildlife Agency's website shows stark photos of the problems feeding can cause: vehicle accidents, herds of dozens of animals clustered at feeding stations, which helps to spread diseases like chronic wasting disease, and oddly, deer that die of overeating. Though corn is a popular supplemental feed, it can be dangerous for deer in the winter, when their systems are geared up to digest woody browse, not starchy carbohydrates. A deer can die within 24 hours, very unpleasantly, after a big meal of corn. Supplemental feeding blends at least two of deer's cultural roles, as victims and as pests, and it troubles our assumptions about where they should be found. Should a deer be in a backyard eating purchased corn? Is it a pest if it then wanders next door and browses a neighbor's apple tree? Or is the real pest the human who provided the corn? Isn't a deer a victim if it suffers convulsions, tremors, frothing at the mouth after we feed it inappropriate food? Is it where it shouldn't be if it runs across a road on its way to and from the feeding site? But deer food is a big business, and more important, it's a big part of how many people understand themselves to experience and help wildlife. It feels good to be benevolent. Whatever natural once meant is pretty far beyond the equation. From the deer point of view, humans must seem a strange and unpredictable nation. Only sometimes do we offer nourishment. Other times we actively drive them away from what they perceive as food sources. When we do invite them to eat, it's with unknown motives. To take food provided by humans is to risk one's life in various ways. The food could turn out to be a simple gift, or it might be unintentional poison or very intentional bait. Tame or semi-tame deer can end up where they shouldn't be in a very different sense. They cross the boundary that designates them as innocent, gentle animals and enter the territory of aggression. It happens if deer feel cornered. Urban does, for example, will defend their fawns in spring from dogs and the people who walk them, but it can also stem from frequent feeding. In Teller County, Colorado, a 77-year-old woman was attacked in her kitchen by a deer that had come to expect handouts from some of her neighbors. She'd propped her door open to bring in groceries, and the doe followed her inside, then kicked her and headbutted her when she tried to shoo it out. A wildlife manager was there to euthanize the deer when, as the woman predicted, it showed up again the next day. In 2012, an Oklahoma ranch family noticed there was a white fawn hanging out with their livestock, even nursing from their cows. They called her Christmas, and she stuck around their fields for years, earning the affection of many locals who'd pull off the road to watch her through binoculars. But Christmas met her end on Christmas Day, 2021, when she was shot by a hunter. The rancher, Paula House-Silzer, called the death heartbreaking, though she acknowledged nothing illegal had happened. We ourselves are deer hunters, she said. Christmas had morphed from anonymous wildlife to named object of affection, and her death was a violation. It impinged, that is, on human feelings. Culture trains us to look at animals in all kinds of different ways. A white fawn who mingles with farm animals triggers reactions in us that say more about our fantasies than anything real in the world. When we say that deer make friends with our puppies or toddlers or even the snowmen we've built in our yards, we're expressing a wish that nature could get on board with our presence, our program, our power. These peaceful encounters seem like a reprieve from the gnawing dread about our own tendency to destroy, and the menace of that destruction inevitably folding back on ourselves. We can be soothed by our Sierra Club calendars, but maybe the trusting presence of a deer nosing our palms for treats works even better. So I'm going to share my screen again and just show you a few more things. So from here, the book goes on to investigate a bunch of other things. So I think I mentioned before, I did talk with some artists who use deer in their work. This is a mural from Charlottesville, Virginia, near where I live, by an artist named Misha Goldberg, who's done a lot of great work with deer. This is kind of the first thing of hers that I noticed, and then I ended up talking with her and doing a studio visit with her, looking at some paintings that she made and drawings that also used deer imagery, and those are a little bit harder to see. I decided not to try to show that because they just don't come across too well on a screen, but this gives you a taste of her work, and several other artists too that I talked to. And actually, since the book has come out, I've met more artists who are using deer in their work. It's a pretty still, popular iconic image for a lot of artists, but it's interesting to hear how they each have their own take on the meaning of deer and the reason that they're using deer in their work. I also observed this woman. She's another museum interpreter. She's here in Virginia as well, and she is working on tanning a deer hide in the traditional Native American way, or almost in the traditional Native American way. There were some kind of interesting anachronisms in what she was doing. And, you know, we kind of talked about that very, very openly. But I was so fascinated watching her do this that I ended up learning how to do it myself. And I've been working on tanning hides at home now. I also got to make a tool out of a deer bone, so experiencing again some of that pretty ancient relationship between people and deer, where they are providers of materials for useful things of many kinds. Interrogating the legacy of Bambi is definitely part of the book. I got to watch a gentleman in West Virginia measuring a set of antlers as a trophy, measuring and scoring according to the Boone and Crockett Club system, which is a whole kind of fascinating world unto itself, this world of scoring trophies. And ultimately got to go hunting with my brother and some other relatives in Pennsylvania. So here's a picture from that experience. So that's it for the presentation, and I'm very happy to take questions, comments. I always invite people to just tell their own deer stories, because a lot of interesting issues tend to come up that way. So if anybody has a good tale of any kind involving deer, I would love to hear it, and let's just see what comes up.
Thank you so much, Erica. This is that, especially that passage from your book. It was really, really good, and like hit
Thank you.
this like existential thing, and our relationship with nature and our desire to control, and it was very poignant. If anybody has any questions, please use the Q&A button or just raise your hand, like Erica said. But I was curious why, maybe while people are typing any questions, why have deer never been farmed as like an animal that we eat? Even historically, like you're saying in Europe, there's like the you know, the hunting ritual with royals, and it seems to just have held this place throughout history of like an animal that's okay to hunt but never, and it's commonly hunted but never like taken into the full thing like a chicken or pig or cow.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great question. And I, you know, so I kind of framed that to myself during my research as why have deer not been domesticated? And the answer is they have been. So if we include reindeer, which are part of the deer family, reindeer have been domesticated for a long time, in both you know, very northern North America and in very northern Europe. But aside from that, there's currently a kind of deer farming industry in New Zealand, which is for multiple purposes: meat, some hides, I think, and milk. You actually can buy deer milk. I didn't try too hard. I was pretty curious about it, but not enough to, you know, devote tons of time to kind of tracking down an internet source and probably paying a lot of shipping for this, but it is out there. But the most kind of salient answer that I found to why have they not been widely domesticated, including in the US, is basically that any purpose they would serve is basically already fulfilled by a different animal, namely goats. Goats are kind of an equivalent of deer ecologically in terms of what they eat, and they're roughly the same size. Goats are smaller, but close enough. And it's very difficult to domesticate a new species. So the effort that it would take to undertake that is, I guess, prohibitive when there are other domesticated species already around that, kind of give you everything that deer could give you. I will also mention that there are deer farms in the US that exist more for the purpose of the hunting world. So not every state allows this, but some do. I'm trying to think if Massachusetts, I really doubt Massachusetts is one of them. The state where I live does not allow it, but next door, West Virginia does, Pennsylvania does, Texas definitely does. You can raise deer in some states for the purpose of basically breeding very large deer with grotesquely oversized antlers to be hunted as trophies. And so the deer themselves are sold, their sperm and eggs are sold, embryos are sold. There are a couple other kind of side hustles that a deer farmer can have, selling urine for scent attractants, which are used by some hunters. So it's kind of a multifaceted business. It's really strange. And if anybody wants to feel kind of disturbed, you can Google images of the breeder bucks, they're called, that are bred on these farms that have I mean, when I say oversized antlers, that doesn't even begin to cover, it's like normal deer, a big deer is like 8 points or maybe 10 points on the antlers, but these breeder bucks have dozens and dozens of points on their antlers. And so it's a really strange kind of little pocket of the deer world that's very specialized and very kind of extreme.
Interesting. That I didn't know some of
Yeah.
that. So I need to look up some of those images and deer farming. Um, I was curious, you had shown some like early art of deer, but what's like the earliest writing about deer in the world, if you happen to know?
That's a great question that I don't know the answer to. I found some, I'm thinking of these kind of Scottish poems about hunting, but those certainly would not be the earliest. Those are kind of like, you know, maybe 16th, 17th century. Deer are, I think it would probably be in more of a mythological context, the earliest writing about deer. There are all these old tales. Deer are part of the Ramayana, the kind of, Hindu epic. There are these old Buddhist tales about deer. They're kind of morality tales. There's a Middle English um, work called Piers Plowman that I cite in the book because it includes a passage about I'm not going to try to pronounce the Middle English, but in modern English it would be bucks that break down my hedges. It's a man complaining about the bucks, in his garden, basically. So very modern complaint back in the days of Middle English. So, but yeah, the very earliest, that's a great question. I'm not sure.
Um, just as a reminder, anyone can unmute if you have a question or story about your personal interactions with deer, or do you have anything that you've maybe didn't have in the book that's like a personal connection or a story yourself, Erika, that you'd want to share?
Well, I did mention learning to tan hides. That's not really part of the book because that happened after I was done writing it, but that has been a very deep experience. So I have obtained hides from my brother and my other relatives who hunt. I've, been on these days of hunting with them where, they get some deer and they are at the end of the day they're skinning and starting the butchering process, and they don't use the hides. So I decided to just start with one, just bringing home one, and I kind of put it in the chest freezer, and I was like, I'll figure out what to do with this at some point. Um, and there's a great book that I bought that explains the whole process very, as clearly as you could hope for. So that was kind of my major um, source for information about this, plus having observed it a couple times in person. And it's a multi-step process. It takes a long time. There are some steps that take several days of, soaking it in this and then soaking it in that and then rinsing it overnight in the creek. And it's just fascinating. And it takes a lot of work, and it takes, it tires you out. It's very effortful. And what really struck me about it was how it becomes a form of intimacy with the individual animal whose skin you're working with, because that skin is like a landscape. It has all these landmarks on it. Every deer has it just like we do. They all have their own scars and the places where the skin is thicker or thinner, and little variations in the skin and the hair. And you get to know, you're going over the whole thing several times, inch by inch. So you just get to know the whole thing, and you find these um, kind of stories there, and just the landmarks of the body. And it just becomes this really, I hadn't expected this, but it becomes a way to connect with that animal as an individual being, which is really different from, I think, the way we normally think of deer in a more abstract way. Maybe some people have, well, I know people have individual relationships with deer that they see often, maybe in their yards. But it's hard to get close, physically close to a deer unless you're feeding it, which again is really not recommended, or if the deer is no longer alive. So that becomes a chance to, know it very well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
There's a question from the audience of how did deer get to be so just so widely distributed throughout the world? And are there other animals that are also so widely distributed?
Okay, this sounds like a kind of evolutionary question. Um, so, and I'll do my best to answer this, but I don't know everything about this, not even close. I do know there are 40 some species of deer throughout the world. There are quite a few in Asia, Europe, North America, South America. Um, there are not any native deer species in Africa or Australia. Um, they, at least whitetails, which is of course the species that we're familiar with here in the eastern US, are I think about 4 million years old. And they are just really great at surviving. 4 million years of different events on the earth, climate changes and disruption, they're still here, and they've also managed to survive, the onslaught of uh, settlers arriving here and having those major effects on them that we talked about earlier. So they're just
Yeah.
incredibly adaptable, great at surviving. There's something about, just the evolutionary design of deer that works really well in a lot of different habitats. And that's probably about the best I can do to answer that question. But, there are people who have written a lot about the evolution of deer. So it's a topic that you can look into, certainly more if you're interested. And I think the other part of the question was, are there other animals that are that widely distributed? Is that right?
Yeah.
Um, Off the top, I don't know. I mean, maybe some types of birds, but um, it's kind of that question of like, what makes a deer, or what makes another group of animals, what are those essential characteristics of that family of animals that you would say, yes, this exists in many, many different places. I mean, I think of, something like crows or coyotes have shown that they have that tremendous adaptability, that they can move it, from a base. Their native range is only in the southwestern US, but they're now in, I think, every county of the lower 48 states because they're just so good at surviving in
Wow.
many different environments. So, some animals are really specialized and some are really great generalists, and deer are in that category for sure.
Great. Wow. Well, I learned so much tonight. If you're interested in getting Erika's book, it's available probably at any bookstore, but on her website. And I'll send out a link to that in the recap email. And you can also get it through the library. But this program was recorded and will be on the YouTube channel, the Cary Library YouTube channel after. And you can share it with your friends and share this really cool talk and really cool book with your friends and brag about all the various deer knowledge that you learned tonight. But Erika, thank you so much for taking time to talk with us tonight.
Well, thanks for having me. It was really fun. Very glad to do it.
Awesome. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.